Thank you, Debbie. As Debbie said, my name is John Harding. I've actually had a promotion since we last met, so I'm now a partner in PWC. And I'm going to talk about pay and reward. And just to pick up on that last point about salary sacrifice and pensions, although it's quite an interesting issue and something that we're currently talking with a few clients about, because as the last speaker said, John, as he said, depending upon exactly how that relief is given, it could actually impact on whether or not salary sacrifice remains attractive for certain sections of the workforce, or I guess more accurately, how attractive salary sacrifice is, depending on how the relief is to be given. I'm going to talk about, I guess, two areas. As I say, I'm a partner in our reward and employment team, which basically means that we work with clients across a number of sectors on reward and employment issues. There's an awful lot happening in this area, as you see at the moment, and I won't read through this slide, and I will jump across one or two slides in the interest of time. But just, I guess, to say that the three key themes I think we're going to face during 2016 are going to be around increased regulation, increased restraint around pay, and the sheer pace of change that we're going to face as reward practitioners. So I'm going to talk really around two things. One is the survey that we do around executive pay. We publish it every year around October time, and I'm going to pull out one or two thoughts from that. And then I'm going to spend the majority of the session really talking around regulation and the change that's taking around all employee pay. But turning to our management and exec pay survey, which, as I say, comes out every year, we've got a healthy and growing number of participants. I know a number of members of the audience participate in it. This year, we're particularly pleased because we've gone down another couple of levels in terms of the pay and benefits that we're able to survey. Some of the key findings that we've pulled together over the last few years is that, perhaps not surprisingly, there's been pay restraints at senior levels. So these different colours here, look at the different tiers, which, as you can see, correspond to CEO down to departmental head. The results of these slides, next couple of slides, are really focused on the FTSE 100, but the reality is it extends across really to all the survey. So there's been a consistent sort of 2 to 3% pay restraint at senior levels within organisations when it looks at base pay. This year, 15-16, looks like it'll be slightly lower than it has been in previous years. When it comes to bonus payouts, then I guess what's been interesting there is that levels 1 and 2, so the more senior executives, are beginning to see their bonuses recover or maybe even improve from where they were back in 2010. But for levels 3, 4 and 5, they still haven't recovered yet to the levels they were back in 2010. Deferral is increasingly common. It's now very much mainstream in terms of deferring bonuses. And I guess what's interesting in terms of our findings is that we're seeing that extending down to levels 4 and 5 within organisations now, becoming much more mainstream. And there may be an argument that's why we're seeing increased bonuses as well being paid, because of that deferral element. This was an interesting one, I think, when it comes to pensions. I mean, I guess we could all have guessed that first graph that we would have seen a dramatic reduction of senior executives within DB schemes. But in terms of DC schemes, the CEO, the main board levels are increasingly not participating in DC schemes for all the reasons that we're aware of around the tax penalties, the reduction of the lifetime allowance, reduction of the annual allowance. Obviously, the new, much reduced annual allowance we've got coming from next year, and potentially, obviously, with a flat rate tax, that might make it even less attractive going forwards. And then in that final graph, we can see this salary supplement and how that's correlated to seniority within the organisation. We then asked our survey participants about their wider benefits and what did they value. And notwithstanding the comment I just made around pensions, pensions was by far and away the most popular benefit. What will be interesting there again is how that changes next year when we begin to see some of those restrictions beginning to bite on organisations. Private medical cover was second. Annual leave, buying and selling of annual leave, that's always very popular at the all-employee level, but it's also popular at the senior exec level, which personally surprised me, and employee share schemes. And this kind of fits in with some other research that we did last year when we commissioned a piece of research where somebody interviewed on our behalf 1,700 individuals across the country, and we basically asked them a series of questions around what value would they place on cash versus certain benefits. And what came out of that was perhaps not surprising when you think about it, but that individuals value benefits differently depending upon their age, their gender, their location, and the industry they work in. So to give you some fairly, perhaps not too surprising examples, women tended to value childcare and private medical over and above men. People in the Northwest and the West Midlands valued cars more than people in London did. People in Scotland and Northern Ireland were particularly keen on holidays. So there's lots of different ways of viewing it. Younger people value gym membership more than older people, which is no surprise to me. But, there's a lot of change there, I guess, in terms of how people value benefits. And I would encourage you, when you look at your benefit provision, to think about your workforce. And if you want the results of those surveys, then do let me know. We're happy to share them around. And that might inform some of your thinking in terms of how you provide benefits. So looking forward to 2016, we also asked participants what were they planning to focus on in 2016. And the top three that came out, the biggest one by far was performance management and improving their performance management arrangements. For me, the most interesting ones were the second two, which was the remuneration governance. So an increased focus on governance around remuneration and paying people, and also equal pay, which I personally think is probably gender pay, and people equate often gender pay and equal pay, but they are slightly different things. And those were where people were really looking to focus at the moment. So looking forward to 2016, what are the sort of key themes that I see coming out more generally? Well, there's a focus on fairness. We see it all the time in the press around pay and fairness and tax and fairness. There's a focus on target setting and linking pay and performance, increased focus there, particularly in a low-pay environment. And then this one is something that I see increasingly employers focused on, how to manage the risks and costs around the increasing regulation in the pay and benefit arena. Which is a nice segue into something that we, PWC, have been doing, which we're actually very proud of, only because we're not very good at graphics, and we've suddenly produced something we think looks quite impressive for accountants. Which we call our 7 pillars of pay governance. And this is an area where I'm constantly having questions come from clients, and it's areas of pain around the national living wage, the national minimum wage, equal pay / gender pay, auto-enrolment, right to work in the UK, holiday pay, and I've forgotten one, the apprenticeship levy. All these areas that suddenly reward practitioners are beginning to think of, well, how are we going to cope with some of these? What will it mean for our business? And what are the risks that we face when looking at each of these? Now, I'm going to touch on most of these, most of them relatively quickly, but I will spend a little bit more time on the national living wage and also on the apprenticeship levy, because I think they're probably things that you should be beginning to think about if you're not already thinking about them. So the national living wage, a lot of detail in here. I guess for me, there's a few really key points that I'd like to bring out. The first point is, my background is I look at legislation. I was eagerly anticipating the legislation on the national living wage, and me and my team were looking every day to see when it would come out and what the detail was going to be behind it. When the detail came out, it was about 150 words, and it was simply a 5th tier of the national minimum wage. And that is incredibly important, because the national minimum wage is, even as a tax practitioner, the national minimum wage is an incredibly complex series of regulations, looking at what pay elements count, which pay elements don't count, which elements, which category of workers get caught in which circumstances. And this is just a 5th level that will apply to workers, no wider than employees, applies to workers who are 25 or above, and not, as the BBC keeps saying, over 25. It will be set at £7.20 per annum. Everyone's heard of the £7.20. Everyone's also heard of the £9, the sort of target by 2020. But the target isn't really £9. The target is 60% of median earnings. And the Office of Budget Responsibility estimates that will be near £9.35. I've seen other estimates suggesting it could even be as high as £9.50. So do take that into consideration when you're thinking of the national minimum wage. Sorry, national living wage. So compliance, because it is a minimum wage, will be enforced by HMRC. And that means that HMRC will come round, and I'm sure you've seen the stats around the naming and shaming. Once you as an organisation have a failure under the national minimum wage, and by default the national living wage, of more than £100 within your organisation across your whole workforce, you will automatically be named and shamed. Unless you've got one of 3 very rare chances of getting out of it, but you'll automatically be named and shamed, and there's a penalty maximum now of up to 200%. So there's really quite a lot of focus from HMRC in this area. We know there's an enormous backlog of clients, well, sorry, not all clients, businesses about to be named and shamed under the current national minimum wage regulations. So expect to see more of that, I guess, over the next couple of months. What are we saying to clients in terms of how they should address the national living wage? Well, the first thing we're saying is really quantify the costs. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the costs in a moment. In my experience, most organisations have underestimated the cost impact of this for kind of two main reasons. One is businesses don't always take into consideration the on-costs, the national insurance, the fact that more individuals will now be liable to auto-enrolment, the pension costs that apply to that. But perhaps most importantly, organisations sometimes don't, or increasingly are doing now, but initially didn't take into consideration the what I call rather inelegantly the trickle-up effect. The fact that you're going to get more and more people who are paid slightly above the national living wage, looking to maintain that differential. So I've got lots of clients where they have office workers who are paid maybe 18, 19, 20,000 pounds, who will be saying, well, under the new national living wage arrangements by 2020, somebody who's doing maybe a 40-hour week in the factory will be earning very close to what I'm earning. So they'll be looking to maintain that difference. So do think about what the costs will be and how you're going to calculate those. Do think about the compliance issue. Do really understand the national minimum wage regulations about the different elements of pay that count and also the different pay periods in which you have to calculate it. Because you don't want to get caught out not paying a national living wage because of the final point, the regulation piece, the reputation piece rather, the impact on your reputation would be significant. And then obviously think about the final point there, which is the impact on broader benefits that this will have when your pay increases. So think about your pay and grading structures. This is a possible phasing of the national living wage. If it was to be £9, as I say, I think it would be closer to £9.35 an hour. And this is an interesting graph. We did a survey over the autumn on the employers' perceptions of and planning around the national living wage. And we took an average of what most people thought the impact on their business was going to be. As you can see, in 2016, it was £1.6 million per annum across that 135 employees. Employers. Obviously, very dramatically between sectors and also size of employer as well. But by 2020, those same businesses, on average, thought it would cost them an extra £11 million. Now, the really, really key thing for me in this is not the absolute figures. But what came as a surprise was every time I cut the stats in different ways, by size of business or by sector, the difference from 2016 cost to 2020 cost was always somewhere between 6 and 7, a multiple of 6 and 7. So if you have estimated the cost at the moment for the current year, it's highly likely that the cost in 2020 to your business will be somewhere between 6 and 7 times what you've estimated it to be in 2016. Certain sectors will obviously be much more impacted than others: hospitality, leisure, healthcare, particularly care homes are facing a number of issues, and retail. And again, you can see the multiples there, how it's between 6 and 7 times impact. We also asked the bigger businesses, this is now cut of the bigger businesses and particularly retail, how were they going to address the challenges the living wage presents? And they brought out things like, we're going to look at changing our pay and grading structures. I think it was about 61% of people said that. About 37% of people said, actually, we're going to be looking at passing on the costs to our customers. 37%, I think, also said we're going to look at our overtime policies and how do we address those. And about a third of respondents said that we're going to be looking at actual headcount. You can see there the retailers, again, that's about 6.5, 7 times. The 8 million going up to 53 million cost, again, the same cut of data. This is just a really quick summary of how we see most businesses responding. You fall into one of 3 camps. You're either a denier, you say, well, it's going to happen to everybody, we'll just have to go through it. You are either a budgeter, so actually say, well, hold on, if we've got this, what do we look about our workforce? Do we look at our pay? Do we look at our benefits? How do we actually get some savings to offset these costs? But the people who are going to be really, really successful at this last group, the adapters, people who realise that suddenly the cost of labour is going to be far more expensive than it was previously and start to do something about it, have multi-skilled workforce or more capital projects. Gender pay, I just want to touch on this, not because it's so much a cost for businesses, but because it's going to be a serious regulatory issue and, again, a reputational issue. We're expecting next week, as early as next week rather, more detail following the consultation that took place last year in terms of gender pay and the gender pay gap. And it's worth being aware that the regulation and the consultation was around addressing the gender pay gap. It's not about reporting the gender pay gap, but actually how you're going to address it. In PWC, we've been voluntarily measuring our gender pay gap and publishing it for the last 5 years. So we've got a lot of thoughts around actually what's the real issues, I guess, when it comes to data? How do you equalise data across different cohorts of people? Our gender pay gap is 16%. It's about 18% generally in the UK, so we're slightly better than general. It's not good enough. But when you then drill down into that gender pay gap, about 2% or 2.5% of our gender pay gap is actually within grades. The biggest issue that we face is you have people like me who are senior within our organisation and not enough of the women coming through who are senior. And that's a different issue that we're addressing at the moment. But expect this to be very high on the agenda. When you've suddenly got to start publishing your gender pay gap, then I think that's going to start getting board's attention. And how do you go about addressing that? And how do you go about explaining why you have that gap? Holiday pay, you'd be relieved to see I'm not going to talk about this slide other than just to bring out, again, this is an area where businesses are beginning to think about holiday pay. The case is being heard again at the moment. We're expecting, again, more elements of pay to be included in the holiday pay calculations. We've done a lot of modelling with businesses that basically takes pay data and takes holiday data and shows how you can reduce the total cost to your business. Many of our clients are suddenly paying holiday pay on all holidays. So that could be the 30 days holiday that most people get, plus 8 days bank holiday, 38 days. In reality, you only have to pay it on the first 4 weeks of EU holidays, i.e. 20 days. So if you do the modelling, you can cut down the cost significantly of holiday pay, which could be used to recycle within the business for other purposes. Auto-enrolment, I'm sure you're all thinking, why is he talking about auto-enrolment? That was 3 years ago, or more than 3 years ago, when I worked with the likes of the big supermarkets to implement the first ones. I guess really sort of 3 things I want to bring out on auto-re-enrolment rather than auto-enrolment is there's a small technical point that when you come to re-enroll, you have to pick a date when you re-enroll. Now that might sound relatively straightforward, but actually picking a date, a single date, if you have weekly and monthly paid employees, can cause some real issues around proration of earnings, because it's unlikely that a date that you pick will be the beginning of a week and the beginning of a month, and it may create some problems. So again, just think through how you're going to do that. Also think through your legacy pension arrangements. I'm seeing more and more clients now, the penny's dropping. They put auto-enrolment in, and now they're thinking, well, actually, when employees' contributions go to 5%, the employee might want to opt into our existing DC scheme where they maybe get double matching or matching. So it's a far more attractive proposition. And then finally, a lot of my clients didn't put in salary sacrifice when they put in auto-enrolment originally because it was only 1%. As that moves up to 5% employee contribution, I think a lot of people will be putting in salary sacrifice arrangements. Apprenticeship levy. I just want to say on the apprenticeship levy that this is something that's coming in from April 2017. I've met with the team at BIS who are introducing this. We're going to get a lot more information about what exactly the apprenticeship levy is in the forthcoming budget. But they do talk about it quite openly as being a payroll tax. And a lot of my clients, when I talk to them, talk about it as being a payroll tax because they don't have apprenticeships. So just very quickly, what the apprenticeship levy is. It's going to start in April 2017. It's going to apply to all employers in the UK. They're still thinking through exactly how they'll deal with group employers or avoiding fragmentation of employers to make sure they get the levy they're expecting. It's going to raise about £3 billion. It's going to fund about 3 million apprenticeships. Every employer will get a £15,000 allowance, which basically means if you do the maths, it's not actually going to cost you anything until your payroll bill exceeds £15,000. But if you've got a 100 million payroll bill, so I don't know, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 employees, I guess, then you're going to end up with a £500,000 cost. And unless you are funding apprenticeships currently or planning to fund a significant number of apprenticeships going forwards, that will be a real cost to your business. It will be operated through the payroll system, through RTI. It'll be paid every week or month. It will go to an account, an electronic account that you have. You can then use that account to fund qualifying apprenticeship training. If you don't use that training within 2 years, it will be recycled. So you'll lose it and it'll be passed out between everybody else. So do think about what impact this is going to have on your business and how you could utilise that for some of your existing training requirements. Final points I just want to bring out are tax and regulation. Last speaker, John, mentioned some references to tax, so I'll jump across one or two of these. But why is income tax and national insurance so important at the present time? Well, because income tax and national insurance accounts for 50% of the 550 billion or so that the Treasury brings in every year. It's been an area that's been relatively lightly policed over the last 5 or 10 years, but we're seeing increasing amounts of change. I think we've responded to something like 12 consultations in the last 6 to 8 months at PWC. The pace of change is phenomenal. So this is a board level issue. There is something that HMRC have, an initiative called Know Your Customer. Well, I love the idea that it's a customer, by the way, but Know Your Customer, where they go out and they do visits. They're focusing on the top 2,100 businesses in the UK, and they're wanting to meet with the heads of payroll, the heads of reward, the HRDs. They want to understand how your share plans work, how your payroll works, how your expenses work, how you categorise someone from being an employee to self-employed, how you deal with terminations, how you send people overseas. They're looking at all the potential low-hanging fruit when it comes to paying people that potentially people are getting wrong. We mentioned salary sacrifice, and there is, and I won't repeat what the previous speaker said around the increased scrutiny around salary sacrifice arrangements, other than a term that I use, which has got some sort of traction within PWC, the good, the bad and the ugly. And those of you of a certain age will now be humming a tune in your minds. But the good, the bad and the ugly is something that when we speak to HMRC, we talk about salary sacrifices. HMRC have some salary sacrifices they quite like. They do like childcare. They do like cycle to work. They actually do like pension salary sacrifice, generally. The bad salary sacrifices are the ones they don't like. They don't like salary sacrifices for own goods. They don't like certain salary sacrifices around electronic equipment. And then the ugly salary sacrifices are all those that have been put in place many years ago that have been neglected in the corner like an unloved child and eventually have begun to rebel and don't quite work the way that you want them to work. And that again is where HMRC will come in and look at them. The restrictions in pension tax relief we've already talked about. Increasingly of interest, this idea of a flat rate tax on pensions that will be coming in a few weeks' time. It's highly likely there'll be some anti-forestalling legislation. I don't know how many of you remember the HERCA from 2010. That was a weekend I'll never get back, but I learned the high income excess relief charge that was introduced by the previous Labour government and then scrapped. Scottish variable rate of income tax, again, it's the same as the UK at the moment, the rest of the UK, but it's highly likely with the Smith reforms that next year we'll see the decoupling so you can have different rates across there. So actions, what would I say the actions are? Really do think about the increased level of governance, think about the reputational risk, think about what these will mean for your business from a cost perspective, engage with your colleagues in finance and begin to do some of the modelling early on so you're on the front foot when it comes to these issues. Thank you very much. That was very quick.
Well, that hasn't terrified us all. Hopefully most of you were aware of that already. But are there any questions? You know, John is clearly an expert in this area, so if there is something that's been niggling you and you think, you know what, now's the chance to ask a question, now's your chance. Try. Yes, we've got a question right at the back and then we'll take the one in the front. So if you can, Rachel, yeah, thank you. If you wouldn't mind saying who you are and where you're from, that would be helpful as well.
Yeah, I'm Lisa Butler from HomeServe. And my question's about the national living wage. We actually voluntarily pay our direct employees the living wage foundation rate.
Yep.
I'm just curious to know what PwC's view might be on how those two rates might work together, whether you see the living wage foundation rate maybe dying out as a result of the national living wage change.
That's a really, really good question. So PwC have been a supporter of the living wage since its introduction. On a personal level, I'm a supporter of it. I think it's a really, really good idea. I thought it was interesting what George Osborne did in the budget, stealing their clothes in terms of creating this idea of a national living wage. The living wage, though, is, A, it's voluntary, B, there's a London rate and a rest of the UK rate, and C, it doesn't have the same level of robust regulation around it that the national minimum wage does. So all the points I was saying around people who enter salary sacrifice schemes can still often get accreditation for the living wage, but would fail potentially the national living wage. So the definitions can be quite different. However, while the living wage is currently roughly £1 above where the national living wage is, I think that differential will reduce dramatically over the next few years. I think it will get much, much closer. And I think that then calls into question the living wage itself in terms of, well, what is the value of the living wage? Have they done their job? Have they created an environment in which you have this minimum level? Obviously, I can't speak on their behalf, but I do wonder where they might go next. Will they focus on living wage, or will they extend their remit to talk about being sort of a good employer, some sort of quality mark around employer, better jobs type arrangement?
And then we had a question down here. Thank you.
Good morning. My name's Trina Spear from Clerks International. You mentioned very quickly on one of your slides about the link between pay and performance. And I just wondered whether or not it's your observation that there is still a commitment amongst employers to have that link between pay and performance and distributing pay awards based on individual performance and contribution.
Good question. I think the answer is it depends, and it varies really between employers. I guess the sort of observation I would have is that I see more and more employers in a low wage environment struggling to really provide pay awards. There's a limited budget, and people are now looking at how do they allocate that out, and that can either be on individual performance or on team performances. But I am seeing an increase in performance-related pay.
And we've got a question right at the back. I think it's the last one I'll take for the moment, but in the back row, please. Thank you.
Kevin Shires from Morrison Utility Services. We currently pay a levy to the Construction Industry Training Board, and now we've got the apprenticeship levy. Any thoughts on that? Because obviously our concern is that we'll be paying twice.
Again, that's a really, really good question. And I know that BIS are engaging with the Construction Industry Board on that very issue to see whether they can avoid employers having a double hit on that. And it's not just construction. There are one or two other boards as well where there's a view as to how can you get credit for that levy going forwards.
Great. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
Very useful.
Thank you.